Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's lunchtime webinar on a relational view of mediation. It's great to have you join us here today. My name is Mike Talbot. I'm the founder, CEO of UK Mediation. Hi, and this is one in a series of our monthly lunchtime webinars talking about all aspects of mediation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm originally a psychotherapist with a career in Gestalt psychotherapy for quite a long time, and then I started UK Mediation in 1999, bringing some lessons from the field of psychotherapy and human relations into working with conflict. So our interest here at UK Mediation is in looking at the person at the centre of conflict, understanding conflict from the point of view of the people who were involved in it, and getting under the skin of conflict as a way of thinking about how an impartial third party might get involved and resolve it. So that's all of our work, that's all of our training courses are centred around that. Our model of mediation that we've developed over the years is all to do with that. So today I'm going to be diving right into all of that aspect of mediation and conflict resolution to talk about how the relational aspect or facet of mediation is so important. So in today's webinar, we're going to be spending around about 40 minutes, and I'm just having a glance there, see who's on. We've got people on from the UK and from around the world. Some people we know and some people we don't. You're all very welcome. And today what we're going to be covering is the following topics. So we're looking at the overview of today. So talking about what we're talking about really, what is a relational model and why is it important? Looking at the primacy really of the people who were involved in conflict and understanding the people as a means to understanding conflict. So that's the sort of the essence of that part of the webinar. And then talking about RETALK is the model we've developed as a hybrid of sort of psychotherapy theory and mediation practice. And just to make the point there that this is the angle that we take on mediation. We're not lawyers, we're not HR practitioners. We've worked with a lot of solicitors and barristers over the years. We've worked with a great deal of HR practitioners over the years. But we provide mediation services and a mediation model as a complement to those professions. So we are not legally trained, we don't offer legal opinion, we don't arbitrate, we don't do this thing people call civil mediation, which I'll come on to when I talk about deal making. And we're not sort of investigators or grievance handlers. So we're interested in the people, we're interested in using a model like RETALK as a way of helping people to have good dialogue. So how mediation works in the RETALK model, so quite a bit of the webinar talking about the process of mediation and what it is about an insight into the psychology of conflict that can help you to resolve that conflict, and then why it helps really, what is it, what's good about it, why do we have this kind of a thing. There we go. So as ever, there's a chat box on screen, so if you have any comments or questions as we go along, you're very welcome to chip in. And I'll pause occasionally to address any comments or questions. We'll also at the end have a little bit of time for Q&A just to mop up any comments or questions that have come in either in the chat box or by email. So if you prefer, or if you're out and about or you're shy, feel free to just send us an email. My colleague is on the tech side of the webinar, so we can address those as we go along, and occasionally there might be links that will pop in the chat box as well. Okay, there we go. So what is a relational model? What are we talking about? So essentially what we do here is we've taken some of the ideas from psychotherapy and said, okay, looks like a lot of these things apply in conflict, trying to understand notions especially about how a relationship works, what psychological contact is. So psychological contact within this sort of person-centered and Gestalt sort of approaches to therapy. This is about the intents relating between two people. So people have good psychological contact when they are fully on board with one another's needs and wants. They have some empathy for each other. It could be conflict, but you still have empathy for each other, and where you're relating quite closely and quite intensely. It's the kind of thing you would have with a trusted work colleague, with a good friend, with a family member. It's that intense relating where there's little pretense, there's little hiding behind any sort of notions of deflecting from a dialogue or failing to see one another for who you really are. It's about that more intense form of relating. And we describe that a lot in psychotherapy, especially when you're working from these more humanistic sort of angles. So person-centered is a variety of psychotherapy or counselling that comes from Carl Rogers right back to the 1950s and 60s. And Gestalt psychotherapy is something that's arisen from a lot of roots to Gestalt, basically going back to Fritz Perls, also in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, so using ideas from psychotherapy, especially from these sort of what we call humanistic schools of psychotherapy, to inform what we do as mediators, and then being able to use that sort of frame, that way of thinking, to be able to understand better how relationship works and how a rupture in a relationship leads to conflict. So essentially we're saying if there's a conflict, it's because that relationship's broken and the psychological contact has been lost. Okay? Put it that way. I was going to say that's putting it simply, but I'm trying hard not to be too jargony and too psychotherapy. But explaining what happens when conflict develops, I think, is an extremely important thing. So I see a lot of process in the mediation field where it's about a running order, a series of steps and stages. If you do this and then do that, and if you say this and say that, and here's 50 questions you could ask. Okay, there's maybe a place for that, but for me and for this organisation, what we say is we need to get under the skin of that. We need to understand what conflict's about, what conflict is, and what happens when conflict develops. Now, we have conflict all the time with one another. You have conflict, road rage driving to work, or somebody cuts you up at the traffic lights, or a family member at breakfast, or a phone call you have mid-morning, whatever it is. There's a lot of conflict about. Whenever two people have incompatible needs, there's going to be conflict. But what happens when that conflict deepens? So when we can't just resolve it by having a dialogue, when we don't have good psychological contact with that individual, when we don't have rapport or trust or empathy with an individual, what happens then? So the conflict deepens. And then if we can understand those processes using this kind of relational model, what we can then do is think about how then can we resolve it, and especially how can an impartial third party get involved to provide the kind of support you would need to resolve it. Okay, that's about the people. That's about the sort of one-to-one relating between two people and the establishment and then breaking of psychological contact, but also a relational model, an effective relational model such as we have developed, is there's a context to every dispute. So what I mean by that is that a friend of mine and I, we play squash together, we get on great. No problem at all. Occasionally have a drink afterwards. If we work together, we've discussed this, he and I, we probably wouldn't get on at all. We'd probably clash heads. So in the context of the squash club, fantastic. Having a beer afterwards, great. Working together probably wouldn't work. Neighbours, people who live next door to each other are at loggerheads. But sometimes when we've brought people into mediation, what we hear from people is, yeah, as neighbours, we really can't get on. Our lifestyles clash, our values clash, our ways of communicating just clash. But if we were to work together, we'd be grand. If we were in the same walking group together, it wouldn't be a problem. So the context in which people come together is significant. Lots of aspects of context, a global pandemic, a recession, a cost of living crisis. These things provide context which can actually promote conflict, can bring people together as well, and can promote conflict. So these contexts are significant in every single dispute. So conflict doesn't happen in a vacuum. Okay? So there we have, that's what we mean by a relation model. It's thinking about what's going on when people get on and have good contact and a good relationship, a working relationship. What's really happening when that goes wrong, and especially when that conflict deepens. What lessons can we learn from that in order to get to the place of resolution? And let's acknowledge that conflict doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's always some circumstances, some conditions, and an environment in which that conflict has arisen. And we need to pay attention to that if we're going to effectively resolve that conflict. Okay, there we go. First of a few diagrams. So let's talk about what we mean by a relationship that's working. Okay, I'll just unpack this here picture for you a little bit. So we've got two people here who are having a relationship that's working fine. So they might be neighbours, they might be family members, they might be work colleagues, they might be business partners, etc. It could be a customer and a service provider, for example. So we've got dark-haired person on the left, light-haired person on the other side there, who are having a relationship that works fine. They're able to have dialogue. They're able to interact with people around them. So these are the buds down at the bottom, 6 of them. These are people, supposing it's in a company, for example. So light hair and dark hair are having a decent relationship, they're having dialogue, and there are other people around. Other people can challenge them, support them, be involved in their relationship, not be involved in their relationship. Everything's working fine. And just as a slight aside, we always consider that conflict's normal and natural. Wherever you have within an organisation a pair of people and the rest of the office or the rest of the company, there's going to be some conflict. Neighbourhoods, squash clubs, whatever it is, there's always conflict. So here's 2 people whose relationship is working okay. What happens is they interact with each other, but they also interact with those around them, be they colleagues, be they friends, be they people in the HR department, be it management, whatever it is. So let's have a think about then a relationship that starts to go wrong. And to illustrate this, rather than just have me talking at you and these little diagrams, so I've got a bit of video for you. So we're going to look at a pair of people within an organisation who happen to have lightish and darkish hair, Sally and Heather, working in office together. We're going to see a typical day in the office with Sally and Heather and the kind of things that can happen between them that might lead to a deterioration in their relationship, given that they've got some decent dialogue going on, but here's how it might start to go wrong.
Hey Liz, yeah, it's nice to talk to you. Yeah, I was just ringing to find out what time we're going to meet for the theatre on Tuesday. Yeah. We go for about 1:30. Perfect. Yeah, it'd be fantastic to see you then. Oh, actually, do you want to go for a coffee first? That would be great.
Oh, for God's sake, it's not like it's even dinner time or anything.
Yeah, 1:30, Liz. Yeah, that'll be absolutely fine. Okay. All right. Bye. What are you doing at the weekend?
Nothing special.
Oh, we're going out with Phil. It's his birthday. Do you know Phil from sales?
Yeah.
It's his 50th. Would you like to come along?
No, it's alright. It's not really my kind of thing.
Oh, it's his 50. You should really enjoy yourself. Come on, you're fantastic time if you come.
Look, I said no, I don't want to go. We've got this important report to get finished. Perhaps we should be getting on with that instead of organising our social life.
Well,
Oh dear. So we can see what's going on there. There's a bit of an incompatibility of needs, incompatibility of styles. There's not good dialogue. They're not really listening to each other. The empathy is getting lost. There's a breakdown in the rapport. Let's get back to my diagram of light hair and dark hair and see what we think is going on. So when that relationship becomes ruptured by conflict, there starts to, think of the analogy of building a wall between the 2 parties. So a few bricks start getting put in the wall, all right? And the dialogue starts to break down between the 2 parties. What we notice is that their goals and their needs and their priorities are to an extent incompatible. So the 2 guys there in the video, clearly there are different needs, different goals, different styles, priorities, and there begins to be built this wall between them. These things can be retrieved if people communicate assertively, if they try and get some empathy and some rapport, and especially if they try and understand one another rather better, then the wall will fall away. But what tends to happen when the conflict begins to deepen is when the communication starts to break down between the 2 parties and they start to form factions. So these other double-ended blue arrows pointing to the outside of their dotted line box. Essentially, that's communication breaking down and them trying to enlist the support of friends and colleagues. They start to form factions. So this is what happens in conflict, is as we find that the relationship's breaking down with that individual, we'll start talking to others. Whispered conversations, WhatsApp conversations with other people, and we start to get into factions. Now that might be going to the boss, it might be going to other members of the squash club, it might be speaking to other neighbours, but we see it a lot in conflict over the 24 years we've been doing this, where conflicts start to get more serious. It's when the relationship is broken or beginning to break, but parties turn their attention to those outside of their one-to-one relationship, factions form, and the whole thing goes to a bad place. Let's have another bit of video and see what happens next.
Oh, has she had a second baby yet? Oh, that's lovely. She had a little boy. What's she called him? Oh, that's really nice. Hold on a minute.
Sorry to interrupt. How's your part of the report going?
Yeah, getting it done.
Do you think you'll have it done by tonight? Only I've got mine finished and I need to work yours into it.
By tomorrow. Yes, hi Ruth. Sorry for the interruption.
Sorry, Sally, I've not finished.
Sorry Ruth, I'll have to ring you back.
You've been on the phone for nearly 20 minutes. You could be doing your report then.
I'm
Before
on the
that,
phone
you had a break.
to Ruth from Albright's.
Well, it doesn't sound like it. You was on for at least 20 minutes, and before that, having a break.
Is that right? That's the crux of it, isn't it? You are constantly monitoring when I go for my break. You think you're in charge, well, you're not. You're always evaluating what I'm doing and timing when I have my breaks. I've had enough of it.
No, I don't. You're just being bloody childish now. For God's sake, can you just get your part of the work done? I've had enough of this. You're an absolute nightmare. I'm going to have to speak to James.
Okay, so what's clearly going on there is there's a lot of, by the look of it, some pent-up aggression. There are things that have gone unsaid. So we might say, hey, maybe they weren't having great contact in the first place. It all comes pouring out. Quite a different communication style there. A bit of second guessing, a little bit of mind reading about misinterpreting one another's motives. Impatience around this difference between their communication styles and the different needs of the two parties. So quite a lot going on. We could talk at length about what's happening between these two guys. But if we come back to thinking about the sort of the model and about what's happening with fair hair and dark hair, the wall now is getting built higher. So the wall now, there's no gaps in that wall. All the bricks have been filled in. And the two parties turn their attention, instead of having contact and dialogue and a decent relationship with each other, they turn their attention to their factional supporters. So what we would call this thing about misinterpreting each other's motives or making assumptions about each other's motives, we call that projection. So projection is a psychological process where you imagine what somebody else is thinking. And quite often those projections are quite negative. So if you're beginning to have conflict or a deteriorating relationship with somebody, you begin to believe that they think ill of you. So you think I'm this, you think I'm that, you don't think I'm this, you don't think I'm that, you don't trust me. So this is projection. It's about giving sort of negative motives to someone else. It's a bit like your own thinking is projected on the screen, which is the other person. That's why it's called projection. So we misinterpret or make assumptions, usually wrong, about the other person's motives and mindset. So then we start to see the other person as all bad. So you go from being okay with somebody to absolutely not wanting to have anything to do with them. And again, context is important. Again, timing, personality, these things are all important. But what we start to do is to just impute bad motives to the other person. They're all bad. Then what happens is that anything that person does or says, we start to use this as confirmation of our negative view of them. So different words for this, depending on which sort of language we're using. Confirmation bias. So I'm biased into only allowing in those things that confirm my negative view of you. So in extremis, what this can mean is these two guys might pass each other in the corridor, and fair hair walks past dark hair, and dark hair says morning, and fair hair says, see that? Do you see how she said good morning to me? That's typical, that is. That's absolutely typical. You see the way she looked at me then, it's like she had a bad smell under her nose. So even very innocent exchanges between the two parties, or innocent actions, an email with a little joke in it, or how that person stood when they were in the queue for lunch. All of these things start to get interpreted and used as confirmation of one person's negative view of the other. The other thing there is cognitive dissonance, which you've probably heard about. It's a bit tired, that notion. It's where we filter out information that doesn't confirm our view. We only hear and only interpret data which confirms our view, and it's very difficult, very dissonant to our view to let in any other data or information. Okay, so here this dispute is developing. So the two guys have turned away from each other. They're not having good contact. There's a wall built between them. They're drawing in their factional supporters. They're starting to see each other as all bad. And there becomes this confirmation bias where everything the other person does or says proves to me what a rotter they are. Okay, using very polite language. As the dispute continues to develop, the dialogue becomes very poor. So it becomes competitive about who's right and who's wrong. So when we're taking this relational view, just to pop back to what we're doing today, the relational view, we're not yet thinking about procedures. We're not thinking about processes. Has somebody stepped over the line in terms of the grievance policy? Is there a need to involve, if it was a housing dispute, have they breached their tenancy agreement? Not there at all. We're looking at the people. We're looking at the relationship between the people and taking a close, fairly forensic view of that relationship as a means to understanding where the relationship has gone. If we understand that, we can better understand how to repair it. So here, as a deterioration in the dialogue, they become quite competitive. Who's going to win this battle? Who's going to get the last word? Who's going to prove that they're the one that's right and the other guy is wrong? So the dialogue becomes quite competitive and becomes quite destructive as well. So the word retroflected there, that's a thing from Gestalt. If you don't want jargon, put your fingers in your ears right now. But it's about when we don't actually say things. So I've got something to say, and instead of saying it, I just swallow it down and I retroflect it. I keep it in. And when we do that, this is when we see people walking around with very scowly faces. This is when we get the in the Zoom meeting, rather than people saying what they think. It's the rolling of eyes. Becomes very destructive because it fuels all of the projection as well. So when in a Zoom meeting, I need to know what this other guy that I've got a bit of an issue with, I need to know what he or she's thinking, and they need to know what I'm thinking. But actually all we're doing is just not catching each other's eye. We're retroflecting. We're not saying what's actually on our minds. And when we do that, it becomes very, very destructive. At this point, with the two, with fair hair and dark hair, only talking to their supporters, their factional supporters, or sometimes going to the more powerful senior parties, like one of them goes marching off to the manager, or the other one goes marching off to HR, or another one turns to all their pals and gets them to gang up against the other individual. This is what's happening around here now. So what can happen at this point is that HR and management get involved. So here now, they're both chewing the ear of the manager, they're both chewing the ear of HR, and saying you, this person, rah, 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 that person, rah, 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 rah. Okay. Allegations are flying. The allegations can become surprising to these third-party supporters, because quite often an element of what people allege about one another is based on the mind reading. It's based on the projection. It's based on what they suppose the other person is thinking. It's based on what they imagine the other person is thinking about the first person. Okay, so HR and management are going, what? And they're having to balance and weigh up and spend the inordinate amounts of time that HR and management have to spend trying to sort out in this very adversarial way what's going on between the two parties. Okay, with their heads screwed on, of course, I would say this. HR and management, the team leader, or maybe the individuals themselves would say, you know what would be a better idea than us getting into this factional, adversarial, win-lose standoff. Instead of doing that, what we could do is think about mediation. Just think about getting an impartial third party to help us to have a conversation. All right. Now, we spend some of our time talking people out of using mediation. All right, that's shock news of the afternoon for today's webinar. Quite often, all that's needed is to facilitate a conversation between these two parties. At the earliest stage, before the projections have really developed to a very destructive point, to help the parties to say what needs to be said, the jargon is to undo the retroflections, to get them to turn their attention to each other, even briefly, just to try and understand the other party, to clear the air, to understand one another's needs, to start to rebuild a bit of dialogue, and to get to the place where even if they continue to disagree, at least they can have dialogue about their disagreement. So you don't need a mediator for that. What you need is a skilled team leader or manager or HR professional just to facilitate a conversation between the two parties. Usually speaking to them both in private first and then bringing them around the table with some rules to have a better conversation. That's it. However, if it goes beyond that, if it goes deeper, if it gets to the point where you do need rather more firmly defined boundaries, where we do need to explicitly contract to use a process like mediation, then that's where it can go. Okay, so a mediator intervenes. Here's a mediator. He or she is sitting on the fence, on the wall in this case, in terms of they're not taking sides, they're not trying to determine rights or wrongs. We're less interested in the past of the dispute and how they got here, more interested in what the parties are experiencing right now, which will inevitably mean they have to tell their stories and give their different narratives about how they got to now. But what's important is the here and now of their discussion as the mediator gets involved. Let's put a few boundaries in and let's get them to have a decent conversation. There's nothing more complicated than that. So what we see here is when the mediator gets involved, we don't want parties bickering to their factional supporters and to their factions. So we will temporarily insulate them from their factions. We do this by having boundaries around confidentiality. We do this by having people speak for themselves, attend on their own and speak for themselves with a few rare exceptions. So that we get a full-on interaction between the two parties with them temporarily prevented from bickering on the sidelines, gossiping, getting other people involved. Because what's going to happen is each party's factional supporters will just fuel their view of the dispute and it doesn't help. Okay, so we temporarily insulate them from their own factions so that we can get them to turn their attention to each other and have a decent dialogue. The objective of the mediation is very simply to rebuild that dialogue. It's about to restore that psychological contact that I mentioned earlier on, to get a clearer view of each other, free of those projections. So actually they can look each other in the eye or glance at each other in the eye, even for a second or two. And instead of competing and trying to prove who's right or wrong or prove who's got the stronger case, we're trying to replace that competition with collaboration. Instead of them banging their heads together, we want them to put their heads together and think about what they can do in order to move on from their conflict. Okay, so first of all, we'll have individual meetings with them so that the mediator will separately have a chat with both sides. So he or she will have the understanding of confidentiality, spending a similar amount of time. The purpose of those individual meetings is to encourage offloading and really to build some rapport between them. The very fact that they have agreed to participate in such a process means that we've removed a few bricks from the wall. I'm getting Pink Floyd right now, but we are saying, okay, they're turning their attention to this process, agreeing to take part, which is why the voluntariness of mediation is very important. The voluntariness means they are putting their shoulder behind it and giving it a go. Okay, so one or two bricks have been removed already. But the individual meetings are to build that rapport with the mediator and encourage some offloading. So we're supporting the parties to think about the future, but also to think about their own needs here, to think about what they want, to think about how sometimes when people have painted themselves in the corner, how they can get some support to come out of that corner. I hope that analogy works. But as conflict goes on, people tend to get quite entrenched and dig in and sometimes say things that they later regret or do things that they later regret. And what we want to do as a mediator with our rapport building, with the boundaries, with our understanding about what makes people tick. And from my point of view, with a good understanding of shame, because actually we get into a place where it's quite undignified and quite embarrassing to step down from some of the positions that we can get ourselves into when we're in conflict. So that's self-awareness. So sometimes it's about, a lot of analogies going on, sometimes it's about holding a mirror up to the party so that they can see for themselves, understand their sort of contribution in the conflict, but also get a better handle about what they're going to do now. Okay, that's where we are with the individual meetings. What happens then is, I think what goes on is that they regain a bit of curiosity about the other. They've both turned up. That's usually quite a big deal in mediation, the very fact that they've agreed to take part. And A notices that B's agreed to take part, and B notices that A's agreed to take part. No, okay. They appreciate, if they can trust the mediator, that they're both being treated the same. They can appreciate the mediator's impartiality. And it lowers the defensiveness. So they've possibly got a way out of their conflict. They've possibly got a way of sometimes backing down with dignity and not getting overburdened with the shame. They build a rapport with somebody who's an empathic listener, who's impartial, and who's got some investment in trying to make sure that a resolution happens here, or at least dialogue gets built here. And I think what then happens is that they regain curiosity about the other person, and they become prepared to take that risk. And it's quite a scary thing to do, of having a direct exchange with the other party. Okay, so let's go on. I've just got a comment there. I just noticed a little question, which I'll get to after I've mentioned the joint session. So when we get the two parties into the joint session, here we go. So through those little gaps in the wall, we might begin to have some conversation, some dialogue between the two individuals. We're still insulating all the factional supporters. We've still got the boundary of confidentiality around the whole process. We're still having people attend on their own and speak for themselves. As they come in the room, we notice they're barely wanting to glance at the other person. Their speech is a little bit clipped. It might be quite attacking. It's certainly not proper dialogue. We can still get a notion around the projections. You think this and you think that. Well, you said this and you said that. Yeah, but what about that meeting the other week? Yeah, well, what about that time you... Okay, so it can be very... riven with allegations. It's quite right up to the point of being quite attacking and quite persecutory sometimes. However, with the mediator's help, there's some beginning of some kind of a dialogue. They've attended. They've actually come into the room with each other. That's a pretty good start. And then what starts to happen is they could, with good support and with the skills of the mediator, start to build a shared narrative about what's gone on, or at least to sort of integrate these two differing narratives. They don't have to agree with each other. They won't agree with each other. I'll be bold and say they're not going to agree with each other. But from this person's experience and the other person's experience, we say, okay, there's two narratives going on here. We can either knit them together and get some kind of a shared narrative, or at least to sort of integrate these two differing narratives to the point where we arrive at the present. And what we're interested in, particularly just to bring in the notion from Gestalt psychotherapy, we're mostly interested in a joint mediation session in the here and now. So you're here, it's now. Let's have the conversation about how what you're experiencing right now, what you're going to do, what kind of conversation we can have right now, and how the two of you can put your heads together and decide right now what needs to happen so that you can get on with being neighbours, get on with being work colleagues, get on with playing squash together, whatever it is. So our aim is to, in the here and now of the joint session, have some kind of a shared narrative created, bearing in mind my caveat that we're not spending too long talking about the past, other than to understand the context in which we're now sitting. And the other thing that happens is they become more inclined to express their own real needs and to be more receptive to the other. Okay, so they become more prepared to express their own real needs. It feels a lot safer, and they're more inclined to be receptive to each other. I'm not suggesting they now love each other. It doesn't work that way. But maybe I'll just let in a little bit of what you're saying. Maybe I'll start to think, okay, then maybe I shouldn't have slammed the door on you. Maybe I shouldn't have yelled at you in the kitchen. Maybe I shouldn't have slammed the phone down or got quite so impatient with you. Okay, so we start to hear a little bit from the other guy, and they start to hear a little bit from me. What I would say is a little bit of that goes a long way. As we get that shred of empathy, the shred of dialogue, the shred of listening, and the shred of feeling that it's safe to express yourself, that does actually start to go a long way. And what can then happen is that they start to see one another more clearly. So the mediator's still involved, the mediator's still exercising this impartiality of supporting the two sides equally. But what's happening now is the two parties are starting actually to see one another more clearly. They're starting to say what really needs to be said. They're starting to have better dialogue. And as that dialogue begins to be restored, the mediator backs off a little bit. Okay, that's their dialogue. So what we notice in a joint mediation session is that when the session opens, mediators usually got quite a lot to say. Of setting the scene, about defining the context, talking about boundaries, talking about his or her role. And then as the dialogue begins to happen, the mediator says less. We talk about an 80-20 rule, so the mediator becomes the one who's just taking about 20% of the time to speak, and the parties get about 80% of the time to speak. So the mediator begins to withdraw as that dialogue starts to improve, and the parties start to collaborate more in trying to rebuild their relationship as the factional supporters remain outside that safe container. Okay. So I'm going to take just a couple of questions so we don't build them up too much. I'll take Fiona's first. So Fiona says, how often does it happen that both parties agree to attend, but on the day one of them backs out? It does actually happen quite a bit, Fiona. So the setup of the mediation is really important. We have to be sure that people are there with at least a tiny bit of a voluntary commitment to attend. If they feel they've been pressured into it when they're already, a bit angry, maybe not just with the other party, but sometimes with the organisation as well. Might be, if it's a housing thing, they might be angry with the housing provider for not having done something about this sooner. And the same in a workplace, they might be angry with management and HR for not having sorted this out yet. So they can be angry with everybody. And then they get told, right, you've got to go to mediation. It's not something you're going to warm to. So if that's the case and they feel like they're being frog marched into mediation, there's a fair chance, Fiona, that one of them's going to back out or magically go sick that day or magically get the date wrong. So it does certainly happen. And in housing, I think it can happen more, because what can happen is that the housing professionals may inadvertently or otherwise say to parties, your tenancy might be at risk if you don't go to mediation, or we're not going to take any formal action about this dispute unless you try mediation first. We don't like being told what to do. We don't like being pressured. And one way of pushing back or pressuring back is to just not attend on the day. So it does happen, Fiona. I haven't got a figure for you. Oh, go on, I'll give you a figure. So let's say 1 in 8 cases doesn't start particularly smoothly because of the way it's been set up, and possibly because people have been told they've got to attend and they don't like it. Okay. I'll take Richard's comment in just a second. Whilst in the meantime, we'll talk about if mediation is successful. It's not always successful, but if it is, what happens is the mediator's gone, they've legged it, and the parties now are having a decent dialogue again. So outside of their dotted line there, we ask them to keep things private. We don't want people gossiping outside of the mediation session. Their factional supporters might be disappointed about that, because what they want to hear is, what happened then? Go on then, warts and all, tell us all about it. But we ask people to keep that dialogue private and to see it as a shared endeavour that they've both taken part in, such that they've restored their dialogue, getting back to this place of better dialogue. Let's say integrating the different goals and priorities or agreeing new ones. So the two guys in the video, Sally and Heather, there might be some way that they come up with, they do actually, about how their different goals and priorities can be integrated, how they can accept that they've got different working styles, different ways of communicating, different ideas about, eating in the office, telephone calls in the office, timekeeping, how we complete tasks, or they agree some new goals and priorities which are shared and which they come up with jointly. So that's when mediation is successful. And what happens is the supporters, they can be, to be blunt, they can be a bit disappointed that they don't get to hear all the goss about what happened in the session. And they stop championing one or the other party. So, those 6 supporters, 6 colleagues there, if that was a workplace thing, probably 3 of them would have been on the fair-haired person's side and 3 of them on the dark-haired person's side. And now they don't have their own champion. Quite often the supporters go, great, we don't have to have our working day dominated by this conflict anymore. I don't need to know who won or who was right or wrong. Let's just get back on with our job. Cup of tea, anyone? So it can be that the supporters are just glad that it's over, or sometimes, especially in workplaces where the conflict's more interesting than the work itself, it can be a bit disappointing. Okay. So that's if it's successful. And the other thing is they re-engage more positively as these two parties' relationship starts to work well again. Or sometimes the mediation doesn't work. The wall is still there. The parties are remaining out of psychological contact with each other. They haven't turned their attention. They haven't built the empathy. They've not got to the place where they feel inclined to step down from the positions they've taken or to come out of the corners they have painted themselves into. So they remain out of psychological contact. Now, this does happen in a proportion of cases. It's unfortunate. It does happen. Having been through the mediation, their negative view and negative expectation of each other become reinforced, and they'll end the mediation going, yeah, typical, you should have heard what they said, you should have heard what he did. He sat there with a face like thunder and wouldn't even look at me. So the negative expectations they already had are reinforced, and they'll come away saying, yeah, typical, it was their fault that it failed. And in those cases, things just remain unsaid. They retain their lack of interest in each other, the lack of empathy between the two of them, and the factional supporters stay involved and continue to support their own champion in their negative view of the other. So if mediation fails, that's where we end up. So then we're talking about other processes, which might involve more formal investigatory processes, more adversarial processes. Okay. We're very positive about mediation. It is a highly successful thing. Things that are going to give it a better chance of success are getting in early, having a skilled and experienced mediator, of course, holding the boundaries tightly, making sure that the confidentiality and the impartiality and the voluntariness that I mentioned are held tightly, and checking in with the parties afterwards as well. So when we've got a result, making sure that that's an enduring result, and we do follow up. And make sure that whatever agreement or resolution or understanding they reach, that it goes beyond just the day in the mediation room and lasts as they get back into the real world again. Okay, so I'm going to go on and talk about the way we've encapsulated this into a model called Retalk. Just before I do that, I've got a question from Richard, who says, what I've heard so far, this sounds a lot like therapy, brackets, dare I say. What's the difference? It's a great question, Richard, because what we are doing is taking a lot of ideas from psychotherapy, a lot of the insights around how people work, what makes people tick. What's the difference? A lot of differences. And for me, having worked as a psychotherapist and trained psychotherapists in the past and done clinical supervision for a lot of psychotherapists, I've got a decent handle on that profession and have thought about, what do we bring from psychotherapy into mediation and what don't we bring from mediation. Some key, very conspicuous differences are in mediation, you get a very short time. So in my years ago clinical practice, I would see people for months or years, weekly 50-minute sessions. Here you get a brief individual session with each party, hour and a quarter or so, and then a joint session, 3 or 4 hours, usually an afternoon of them. So it's a very short period of time. Second big difference, Richard, is that we're not going so much into the past. In psychotherapy, we're probably interested in where things have come from, using the principle that if somebody's life isn't working for them and there are issues in the present, if we find out where those things have come from, we can leave them there. That's the sort of the way that people put it. It's a little bit pat, but it's what people say. The other thing is the intensity of engagement. Here we do need to build some empathy. We do need to establish rapport between the mediator and the individuals, but it goes down to a certain level. It should be genuine, it should be sincere, we should actually be for real, becoming empathic with each of the parties and building some rapport with each of the parties, but it goes this deep. With psychotherapy it tends to go that deep, so you get to know your psychotherapy clients very, very well. And the last thing I'd say about the differences is about the outcome. So as in psychotherapy, we are It doesn't mean we don't care, but the term that people use is we're indifferent to the outcome. So where somebody ends up as a psychotherapy client, or a couple coming into psychotherapy, where they end up, it's really their business. It's their business. And we do what we do and make sure that people build awareness and, become, hopefully, not as distressed as they were when they first started paying for psychotherapy. In mediation, we've got an outcome in mind. We want to get the two parties back working together by rebuilding dialogue. It doesn't have to be an agreement, a highfalutin written agreement, but we do need them to be collaborating again. Same with neighbours, same with people in a family that's trying to stay together, same with business colleagues, whatever it is. We do have an end in mind, which is restoration of the relationship and restoration of dialogue. In psychotherapy, we don't have that. Okay, so hopefully that's an answer there, Richard. In terms of the relational model, we've encapsulated it into something we've called RETALK. So RETALK's about rebuilding dialogue, okay? Hence the name. So we're trying to restore dialogue, we're trying to repair relationships, we're trying to also rebuild teams, because everything I've said about individuals here applies to teams. There's a lot more to say about what goes on in teams. They are very complex things, but essentially we can use a lot of the same principles, thinking about conflict as a breakdown in relationship, thinking about how projections can develop when people start to fall out with each other, thinking about how the contact gets lost, thinking about how what we're about is using the three essential boundaries of voluntariness, impartiality and confidentiality to get them into a room and to have some dialogue. So it all works with teams as well. So RETALK's about, it's a relational model. It's about getting the dialogue working again, repairing the relationship and rebuilding teams. Why do we do all this? Why is it important? Well, one thing for me is we can start to explain what we do. And I think, coming into this field many, many years ago, I thought, okay, mediation's great. I'm very interested in this. How does it work? Why do we do this? Why does it sometimes work and sometimes doesn't? And also, again, back to you, Richard, in therapy, we're very interested in where people's distress comes from, where people's sense of being ill at ease, where it originates from. And we work on the principle in therapy that, unless you know that, it's very difficult to resolve it. But same thing can work in mediation. So why do we have a relational model? Well, if you understand what's going on in conflict, it does help you to resolve it. And again, back to our principle, if you understand the people better, then you can better understand their conflict. It also acknowledges the impact of context, and especially of external actors, people outside of the dyad. And the other thing, another thing is, what does the mediator add? Why can't people just have their conversations? What is it about mediation that actually adds something to the mix? What is the mediator bringing to the party? And I think we can better answer that question when we use a relational model and take a relational focus. And finally, it helps us to know why mediation mostly does and sometimes doesn't work. So we can look back at cases and say, here's why it worked. And look back at the minority of cases and say, here's why it didn't work. Okay? And I think without this kind of a relational model, we haven't got that. And if you look at other forms of mediation, with the greatest respect, often there's a process, often there is a series of steps and stages. A little bits of theory are often inserted here and there. But for me, having a coherent model about relational work, it helps us to answer that last question about why it does and why it doesn't sometimes work. So I'm aware of the time. I got in my groove and I've been talking perhaps a little more than I'd intended. So we've got the model of RETALK. It's essentially, I just wanted to mention, people sometimes say, so is this facilitative mediation or not? It's transformative and facilitative. It's a long, long way as far as you can get from civil mediation, deal making, evaluative settlement conferencing. So there is a process that's developed over the last 15, 20 years or so. It's now called civil mediation. It's essentially deal making. We don't have anything to do with that, and it's about as far as you can get from that. We don't align ourselves with civil mediation or with evaluative settlement conferencing at all. We're interested in the people and what's going on in conflict. Use it online as well, of course, we've had to. Works pretty well with some tweaks. Less successfully with teams, but that's another story for another day. A lot of proven success. We've had a 25-year very successful business. about it. And if you take a look in the webinar archive, you'll find a few more bits about it. And my colleagues just popped some information there and a link so that you can go to Retalk and find out a little bit more. So there's usually a few questions by email afterwards, but if there are any other comments for now, do pop them up. Or if you want to, if you think of something afterwards, just email us on that email address there, webinar@ukmediation.net. So just a quick mention just before we go about some other webinars around the corner. That's us with the relational model of mediation, but also to complement that, you can find a lot of our previous webinars on the link that's just appeared there in the archive of webinars. There's loads of stuff in there. You can register for future webinars if you go to that other link there as well. And in May, we're talking about humanising commercial disputes. So looking at our approach to commercial mediation, which again essentially focuses on the people. It's not about deal making, it's not looking at the rights and wrongs of people's claims and responses. It's not taking that legal view of mediation. That's sailed off big time. Civil mediation, deal making has sailed off sort of over the last 15 or so years. It's a service that's offered usually through legal professionals. Greatest respect to you, it's what some people want, it's not what we do. So we're going to be looking at the human aspect of commercial disputes at the webinar in May, and in June we're going to be looking at online or offline. So we did this a little while ago, we've had a demand for it again. I think some people who had to do online mediation have now said, you know what, I'm going to build my business around this, or I'm going to offer it as always offer it as an alternative to face-to-face. You can do online mediation. We prefer face-to-face. It can be done, and I'll be talking in this webinar in June about online or offline and how we can use Zoom, Teams, etc. to do mediation and how that compares with doing it live. Okay, so that's the end of our webinar today. Ran over slightly. That's all about the relational view of mediation, about how understanding the people can help you better understand their conflict and then how to resolve it. Okay. So there'll be a few questions or discussions afterwards, but for now, if you can keep in touch, that'd be great. You can like and subscribe, check out our YouTube, there's our Twitter, there's our LinkedIn, there's our Facebook, all the usual channels. Check out the website, look at the library of webinars, a lot of stuff there. All the links are in the chat box. That's us for today. Have a good weekend. It's raining here, I don't know about you, hope it brightens up, and thanks for watching for today. That's been a relational view of mediation. I've been Mike Talbot. Thanks for your attention and your comments and questions, and we'll see you again next time.